get your attention, please?
Public wink.
Thank you. So, we have a very special guest here to introduce this year's topic. This is Paul Kerr. He is an analyst on arms sales issues for the Congressional Research Service. Essentially, when Congress wants to know something, he's the guy they call. So you are also going to be able to ask him any of the questions you have, but he has some opening remarks to kind of get you situated first. So I'm going to stop talking now and turn you over to Paul.
Thanks, David. One thing David did mention, I cover a lot of other issues, and so sometimes when Congress has a question on arms sales, they might call me, and I'll tell them to call someone else, because there are certain things I don't know. And if there's something I don't know, I will tell you and try to get the answer or work something out. I'll just start by saying, I'll tell you the Congressional Research Service is what it sounds like. It's a nonpartisan research arm of Congress. We provide information and analysis to mostly Hill staffers, and we don't tell people what to do. The way we put it is we don't answer should questions, but we give Congress information to help them make decisions. So that's what I do. I'll just a disclaimer, because I like my job, I need to keep it, and so I'll tell you that any opinions I discussed here are mine and not those of the Congressional Research Service or anybody else. Now, the topic this year I think is quite a good one. I did some debating and coaching years ago. I would be excited to coach this topic if I were still in that business, because I think arms sales is incredibly important. I think the process of debating it will teach you quite a bit. I think there's something in this topic for just about anybody, regardless of what your interests are. And arms sales are just in and of itself an important topic. The United States is the leading arms seller of weapons in the world. We sell weapons to lots of people, lots of governments, I should say, and there's been quite a bit of controversy about them in recent years. It is one of the most important foreign policy tools that the United States government has, so it's good, I think, that people are talking about it. The thing is that the terminology in the topic might look a little intimidating. It would be a little easier to understand if it just said the United States should end arms sales or something like that. The problem with that is it would be a little easier to understand, but it would not, in my opinion, be a very good debate topic, because it would be, I think, far too broad and ultimately would get unwieldy very quickly. So I think it's worth, at least I hope it's worth, investing a bit of time up front to understanding what direct commercial sales are and what foreign military sales are, so you can have better debates down the line. And I'm going to endeavor to keep this as short as possible, so I can hold your attention for at least a little while, and then we can get to questions, of course, okay? Now, the one thing that this, I will say I'm not going to get into very much. I can try, but I'm not an expert on, say, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Yemen. I know something about those conflicts. I have colleagues who know more than I ever will about those, so I try not to step on their toes. So like I said, can answer some questions, but that's not going to be the focus of this. I also know next to nothing about how weapons work. To be honest, I can tell you the process by which we approve them and sell them, but if you're going to ask specific questions about, guns or aircraft, I am not your man. Okay, so now the idea of this is to provide some basic facts, and I'll apologize in advance if I start using too many abbreviations. If you don't understand something, you can raise your hand. I try not to. This is DC. Everybody uses abbreviations all the time, and so I'll probably do the same. Now, the first part. Now, reasons. Why do we sell defense items? Okay. By the way, when we sell weapons, really what we're talking about are things, they are defense articles, which are items, and services, which include things like maintenance, repair, upgrades, training, and technical data associated with all of those things. Now, I will use defense articles or weapons kind of as shorthand, but understand that foreign military sales and direct commercial sales do not just govern tangible items. They don't just govern end products, okay? Now, why do we sell them? Well, there's a number of reasons, and you can get these from, I took this list from the Arms Export Control Act, also the Conventional Arms Transfer Policy, which the Trump administration issued in 2018. And we do it for a number of reasons. We engage in cooperative defense programs with other governments, so we sometimes will We work with other governments to improve their defense capabilities because we think that enhances their security, enhances U.S. security as well. We aid friendly countries in conducting defense operations in their neighborhoods for the reason I just mentioned. We sell these items to improve interoperability because we conduct a lot of, probably the bulk of our military operations with other governments. So we want our militaries to be able to work together well. We also sell weapons to improve and maintain and improve the health of our defense industrial base. The United States defense, for military equipment, weapons, other kinds of military equipment, the United States relies on the private sector. They're not state-owned enterprises like they are in some other countries. Now, the argument is that the defense industrial base is necessary in order for the private sector to provide items that the military needs. Okay. Now, the more items that the United States can sell abroad, the stronger our defense industrial base is. Closely related to that is the goal of reducing the cost of weapons for the U.S. military, because the more items that U.S. industry can sell, the lower the cost will be ultimately for the U.S. Defense Department. The last one I'll mention last two are relations with foreign governments. We oftentimes sell weapons and other defense articles to governments in order to improve and maintain bilateral relationship with that government. Also to send a signal to both that government and other ones that we take defense commitments seriously. We have defense commitment treaties and other defense commitments with a number of governments, and we want those governments and others to know that we take those commitments seriously. And providing weapons, other forms of defense of this kind of assistance is part of it. Now, also, it's important to understand that direct commercial sales, this is what direct commercial sales and foreign military sales are. It's important to understand this. I wish I'd understood this. I should have understood it better when I debated and coached. That these are programs which exist pursuant to specific laws and regulations and programs. Okay. Now, they're constrained by both legislation and regulatory requirements. They're not the only methods by which the United States transfers weapons. There are some others, I'll get to them at the end, but they're the most important, I think, by far. And so this is important to know what the topic governs and what does not govern. Okay. Now, they are, traditionally, most of the weapons sold by the United States have been through the foreign military sales program. Increasingly, the United States is selling more through direct commercial sales. The exact numbers I don't think are known, at least publicly, but that is a fact. Now, some items are only sold through the foreign military sales process, and there are a few items which we do not sell through the foreign military sales process. There are certain items the United States does not sell to anyone. Cluster munitions is kind of the obvious one. There's actually a prohibition on the United States selling that technology, for the most part, selling that technology to other governments. Okay. Now, direct commercial sales are what they sound like. It refers to the sale of U.S. licensed defense articles directly from U.S. firms to foreign governments. So a foreign government decides it wants to buy a certain defense article from the United States. They can go to a company that sells it and buy it. Now, the process for that just simply is that if a company wants to sell the item, it has to apply for an export license. So they apply to the State Department, and they detail the sale. They say, this is the item, this is the customer, this is what we want to sell, and the State Department reviews it, and they either approve the sale or they don't. Sometimes they could put conditions, but basically that's how the process works. So it's fairly straightforward. The foreign military sales program refers to the sale of all of these items on a government-to-government basis. Okay, now, what does that mean? Well, first of all, the foreign military sales program is not a foreign assistance program. We don't give, through the FMS program, we don't give anything to anybody, okay? We sell it now, and the idea is the foreign government gets to use the same process for buying weapons that the U.S. military uses. In effect, the U.S. government acts as a broker between the company that's selling the item and the customer, right? Now, the way it's paid for is the government, the purchasing government, is charged, there's a certain surcharge, which I think is something like 3.5% now, on the total sale, and that money goes to pay for the administration of the sale, which really means U.S. personnel, U.S. government personnel who negotiate with the contractor and all the rest. that money all comes from the purchase, so they pay for that. Okay. Now the reason why there are certain things, as I noted, that we only sell through the FMS process, and in many ways, the United States government finds this process preferable because it enables governments to, with sort of a limited capacity and knowledge for dealing with contractors, to get fair deals. Also, there's something that's called, what the US government calls the total package approach, which means that the purchasing government will work with the US military personnel generally, it's generally Defense Department personnel, will work with them to find out, determine what they really need given their security situation and given what their militaries are able to absorb and operate. So we help to just best shape their requests. And on top of that, the total package approach means that the government will get support, maintenance, and training and things like that to make sure they can use whatever they're buying. There are all kinds of stories about governments buying military hardware that just sits there once it arrives because they can't get spare parts, and they don't know how to operate it properly, and et cetera. So that's what the total package approach is. That's also one reason why the US government argues that countries are better off purchasing items from us than from some other competitors. Okay. Now, as I said, these programs exist pursuant to legislation. So the Arms Export Control Act is the law which authorizes the foreign military sales program. It also authorizes the executive branch to issue export licenses, as I just mentioned, for direct commercial sales. Okay. There's another law, the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, which contains a lot of restrictions on sales to other governments, mostly relating to human rights and the uses to which these weapons may be put. Now, there's a lot of overlap between the Foreign Assistance Act and the Arms Export Control Act for reasons I don't fully understand. Someone explained it to me once, but so those are the two main laws that you need to know about. And it's important for this topic because, as far as I can tell, it's topical for both the executive branch to reduce or end foreign military sales and direct commercial sales, but Congress, as I'll explain a little bit later, can also make them do it. So who acts matters, and whether the potentially relevant, whether the act occurs pursuant to, say, legislation or pursuant to a unilateral decision by the executive branch. Now, so what kinds of weapons are we talking about? Well, there are some items, as I mentioned, which are on the, turn my page 2. Now, the Arms Export Control Act authorizes what's called the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, which is what it sounds like. They're regulations that are placed on the executive branch that say what the executive branch can and cannot do with respect to arms sales. It's both direct commercial sales and foreign military sales. Now, the International Traffic in Arms Regulations contains the U.S. munitions list. U.S. munitions list, so if you want to know what kind of items, like what are we really talking about, that are covered via foreign military sales, direct commercial sales, those are items on the U.S. munitions list. It's publicly available. It is very long, it is very detailed, okay? Do not encourage you to read all of it, but to give you some idea of what's on there, and I'll make this point first. There are items that are called dual-use items, which are what they sound like. They're goods that are primarily intended for civilian use but could have military applications. Certain kinds of computers, good example of that. Certain kinds of encryption technology, also an example. Okay, those items, and this is a distinction with a difference because those items are called, they're called dual-use items. They are regulated by the Department of Commerce. Okay, so some of these items that you might, now there might be an author somewhere who says these items are weapons or could be used as weapons. Be that as it may, if they're not on the U.S. munitions list, I do not believe they'd be covered by direct commercial sales or foreign military sales. Okay, so and they have their own world, their own universe, own set of laws and regulations governing their export. Now, so as I said, U.S. munitions list, those are the military items that are not dual use. Some of these items are not necessarily what you might think of as weapons, which is why I think the term arms in the resolution is interesting, because conceivably, I guess there could be items on the U.S. munitions list which would not be considered arms. I'm not going to get into that. But there are items like, there's a category called, to give you an example, called protective gear. There's certain kinds of protective gear that soldiers will want to wear in certain combat situations. Okay, now those are defense articles. They're on the U.S. munitions list. They are governed by direct commercial sales and foreign military sales. Those, at least to me, are not weapons in the way I traditionally think of them because they're protected. You can't kill anyone with them, even though you can use them in a military operation. Okay, now the list includes, as I alluded to before, it's not just the end items, but it's also, like say, an aircraft or a ship, but it's also the parts, components, accessories, attachments, and the technical data that can tell you how to make all of those things. Okay, intangible transfers, computer codes, instructions, those things are all covered by export as well. Okay, now some examples of items on the list are firearms, missiles, bombs, landmines, ammunition, warships, training, military electronics, guidance equipment. The list goes on and on and on, believe me. Okay, but that's kind of what we're talking about, or what you might think of as weapons, just anything that can, most things that can be used in a military operation. Now, as I said before, there are restrictions. So what are they? Well, U.S. law contains a number of restrictions regarding the provision of defense articles. For example, they may be sold only for specific purposes. Now, those include internal security, legitimate self-defense, and prevention of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. There are a few other items as well, but those are the main ones, I think, for this discussion. Now, the executive branch also has to consider whether a given sale might increase the possibility of outbreak or escalation of conflict, that's the letter from the law, and or contribute to an arms race. Now, purchasers via both FMS and direct commercial sales are subject to a number of restrictions as well. They have to agree, for example, not to transfer defense articles without permission, and they have to maintain security on the defense articles to make sure U.S. technology stays where it's supposed to and with the users who are meant to be using it. And they have to prevent the diversion of those articles as well. Now, when purchasers buy these items, they have to sign what are called end-use agreements. And these agreements spell out in great detail what these items can be used for and who can use them. Okay, so you can say, we're selling you this plane, it has to be operated by this unit of the Air Force, and this is what it can be used for. If the country deviates from any of those restrictions, then that's a violation of the end-use agreement, and I'll mention a few things later that, some potential consequences. Now, how do we know if a country is obeying the law? Well, there's something called end-use monitoring, and there are different programs for the direct commercial sale, or direct commercial sales that perform military sales. But the mission is the same. It's to make sure that recipients of U.S. arms are using them in the manner in which they're supposed to be used. Now, and that includes people who will visit military bases and look for whatever it is we sold them, and to make sure that they are where they're supposed to be, and they'll discuss any information they might have about instances where they were used improperly. Action could be taken from there. It's not necessarily the most important thing. These violations could be minor. They're very easily corrected. Other times, the violations are significant. But there is a process to make sure people are obeying the law. Okay. Now what happens? As I said, there's some consequences. So what happens if a country violates these restrictions? Well, there are a number of things. I mean, countries, in some cases, a U.S. official might see a country doing something with a weapons system and say, hey, just stop doing that. In one case, the story I heard was that they had a country had a data link operating from a transfer radar system, and it was for diagnostic purposes to the company. They weren't supposed to be doing it, and they knew they weren't supposed to be doing it. They did it anyway, and someone from the U.S. government came by and saw that and said, look, you need to disconnect this. That's a violation of the end-use agreement. They did so. Problem solved from our perspective. Okay, so fairly minor, something they shouldn't have done, but it's corrected, behavior ends, and we're okay. Now, there are more extreme violations, and ultimately what could happen is a country can be essentially cut off from arms sales. We can, it's actually a requirement in the law that the sale or delivery of U.S. origin defense articles, if the President or Congress find that they've misused them, the agreement is, the country will be ineligible for purchase of U.S. arms in the future. So essentially they can be cut off. And that can be extremely important because even if, as I said, a specific item still stays in the country, the support, maintenance, provision of spare parts, provision of ammunition is very important. So a country, say, might have a U.S. supplied aircraft. If they can't get bombs to drop from it, then the aircraft isn't very useful to them, at least from that standpoint. standpoint, right? So that's one step. There are ways also in which we can modify a sale to say that, that there are certain things, we will supply your government with in the future. There are other things we will not supply them with. Okay, so sometimes it can be a complete cutoff, sometimes it can be a modification. It all depends on the circumstances. It's all decided in effect on case-by-case basis. Okay. Now, what's the process for all this? Well, the Department of State manages the FMS process. There's an agency called the Defense Security Cooperation Agency. They are part of the Defense Department. They really implement any individual case. So the way I think about it is the Defense Department handles the details. The State Department is the ultimate authority as to whether a sale can go through or not. Okay, so what will happen is the process starts when a government issues what's called a letter of request. And that is what it sounds like. The government says, we want to purchase these items, and this is a notional cost, what we're willing to pay for it. There's a process by which that goes through the federal government, and it depends on who the purchaser is, it depends on exactly what they want to buy, but there's a process that the sale goes through. Different agencies evaluate it, Defense Department, State Department, various subcomponents of the State Department, the intelligence community, perhaps others. They evaluate the sale, and they will either approve it, deny. They either recommend disapproval, recommend denial. They might recommend some modifications, but there is a review process. Okay. Now, once that all happens, then the sale is notified to Congress, and I'll get to the details of that in just a minute. If the sale gets past congressional review and gets past review of the executive branch, of course, then the sale is approved. What is issued then is called a letter of offer and acceptance, and that contains all the conditions of the sale. It's just what's going to be sold, how much it's going to cost, all the support provisions that we talked about earlier, and all the requirements, the end use requirements, again, also are included in that. The letter of offer and acceptance is a contract, which can be important for some arguments on the negative because in some extreme cases, canceling an arms sale could mean canceling a contract, which is something that the U.S. government is typically pretty reluctant to do for reasons you can probably imagine. Okay, so now, as I said before, the direct commercial sale process is is a bit simpler in the sense that, as I said, a U.S. company will come to the State Department and apply for an export license, say we want to sell this thing to this country. That also goes through a review process with the same players, I think all the same players that I just mentioned, and they'll either approve the license, deny it, or maybe suggest modifications. Okay. Now, I mentioned Congress. Now, for certain sales, they have to be notified to Congress. Now, which sales have to be notified? Well, it all depends. Now, it depends on how much the dollar value of the item, and it depends on who it's being sold to. Okay, so for certain countries, what they call NATO plus 5 other countries, there's basically one set of rules. For everybody else, there's another set of rules. I will mention that there are some governments, they're not particularly important for this topic, but just that we don't sell weapons to at all, by law. State sponsors of terrorism, for example, we do not sell weapons to Iran, we don't sell them to Syria. You can imagine there's a few other ones, right? But leaving those countries aside, there's another category of countries, just everybody else, really. And depending on, again, on how much the item is, or how much the sale is for, because it could be for more than one item, depends on how much it is and who is going to, there's a notification that's submitted to Congress. Now, there's a pre-notification process, and this gets complicated. I suspect you're doing the course of debate research, you'll read a lot of things that are inaccurate about this because it's not widely understood. It's also not written down in law anywhere, so it's hard to understand. But basically, the executive branch will go to Congress, will go to the relevant committees, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and they'll say, hey, we're going to sell, we intend to make this sale. We know you have a congressional prerogative to review it, so we're going to let you know. And the idea of this is so any controversy, any disagreements can be resolved outside the public sphere, because public arguments, especially over sales to other countries, are frequently seen as unproductive, right? So that's the informal process. And so different members, I believe the tradition is the chair and ranking member of each committee, although I would not swear to that. They can place what's called a hold, which in essence says, look, you're not going to proceed with the sale unless and until we've resolved our concerns. That is really something governed more by custom and tradition than by law, which again makes it a little hard to understand. But at any time, though, the executive branch can initiate the formal review process, and this is set out in law. And what this means is the item is notified to the relevant committees, Senate Foreign Relations and House Foreign Affairs. And it sits there for 15 days for NATO plus those other countries, or 30 days for everybody else. And after those periods have elapsed, then the administration can proceed with the sale. The exception is if during those that period, the 15 to 30 day periods, Congress enacts what's called a joint resolution of disapproval, which is legislation that says the executive branch can't proceed with the sale. Congress has never successfully blocked an arms sale via this mechanism. Now it has adopted, there was recently just legislation, I think approved last week on the House side, that would have this effect. It does not appear that there's enough votes to overcome a presumed veto. The presumption is that the president is going to veto it. So far they've not demonstrated that there's enough votes to override that veto. I don't know what's going to happen. I wouldn't try to predict it, but this is the closest we've come in a very, very long time to this ever happening. I mean, we have a report about this, and you had to go back to until recently, you had to go back to the 80s to find examples where Congress even came close to stopping an arms sale. Okay? Now, Congress also has the option always, because Congress writes laws, they can always adopt a separate legislation which would say the administration can't proceed with the sale. Okay, or they can proceed with the sale, they have to modify it. They can write laws that say just about whatever they want, governing that particular transaction. Okay. The last thing I will mention, actually, I'll mention two more things. One is that there is something that's appeared in the press a bit. There's a provision in the Arms Export Control Act that allows the president to waive this congressional review period I talked about if the president decides there's an emergency. The president recently did this in May. Okay, it did it for a package of long series of weapons sales, mostly to Saudi Arabia, some to the United Arab Emirates, one to Jordan, I think. And the president said there's an emergency, we're proceeding with the sale, and we're waiving the congressional review period. Congress is not particularly happy about it. It does seem like the sale is going to proceed anyway, unless, well, depending on what happens with the law I just mentioned, or the bill I just mentioned that was adopted last week in the House. But it's a fairly obscure provision, but it's become very much less obscure in recent months for the reasons I just outlined. Okay. Now, last thing I'll mention, I said that there are other ways that weapons can be transferred. So a potential negative argument for someone to say, okay, look, even if you were to decrease or ban direct commercial sales or foreign military sales to this government, the administration could find another way to transfer it. To me, there's a significant burden placed, like the negative would have to have evidence that demonstrated that that was the case. But from a legal standpoint, I will say that other types of transfers, which are not covered by FMS and TCS, are what are called excess defense articles. It's one. They are what they sound like. The United States, decides we don't need a specific piece of military equipment anymore, so we can give it. We can either give it, and I think in some cases sell it to another government. And there's an entire separate program and process for doing that. It's not the same thing as foreign military sale, though. Okay, and you can probably imagine that our cutting edge military technology typically is not transferred in this manner because excess means what it says, right? Now, also covert action. The National Security Act of 1947 has a provision where the president can make what's called a covert finding of covert action. What that means is that the president authorizes the intelligence community to do something. It's classified, we don't know what it is, and it might involve the transfer of weapons. In recent years, U.S. origin defense items have turned up in places like Syria and others. Press reporting all says it was done by the CIA. I honestly don't know, but those kinds of small weapons can be transferred that way. These kinds of transfers are not governed by the Arms Export Control Act or anything else really. And so, when it comes to these kind of transfers, the intelligence community has a great deal of leeway to do whatever they want, or they can't do whatever they want, but they have a great deal of leeway. Now, We do not, to my knowledge, transfer major weapon systems this way, so most cases you would run into really wouldn't be impacted by this. At least I don't think they would be. The last thing I'll mention, though, is kind of important, is something called building partnership capacity. There is an entire separate set of programs governed by the Defense Department, and they exist really apart, both in policy and legislation, from foreign military sales and direct commercial sales. Now, these involve the transfer of weapons, but they involve all kinds of things. In many ways, they're a bit of a foreign aid program. Really, after the terrorist attacks in 2001, there was a concerted effort made to help other governments really become, in our eyes, more able to prevent terrorism and all the kinds of conflicts within their own territory. So this is involved, they don't call it nation building, but in a lot of ways that's what it is. It's involving it involves helping countries develop capacity in their defense sectors and other places to conduct military operations on their own territory. This can involve the supply of weapons. It involves a lot more than that, though. And so anybody who gets the idea that we could sort of, say, significantly and or reduce support to, say, Afghanistan or Iraq under this topic, I think would be mistaken. You could certainly, it is topical to decrease foreign military sales to Iraq, but there's a lot of other support we give to the government which is not impacted by foreign military sales or direct commercial sales. You're all still awake, I'm going to say. And I have to apologize, my eyesight has gotten worse like last month, which is what I'm having trouble with.
All right, so at this point, everyone should open up to questions. This is a perfect opportunity to take advantage of the topic expert. I see a few
So, are there any things that prevent like blowback or dispersions from happening? Especially since you said that there are other means of transferring weapons.
Blowback or dispersion meaning?
Like blowback and dispersion meaning like our weapons being used against us in combat, or like weapons getting in the hands of people that we don't want it to.
Yeah, that's what end use monitoring is meant to do. There's an excellent discussion to be had about how well this works, but yeah, I mean, because those kind of, a government, when they purchase weapons from us, they have to agree to maintain custody and to use them, as I said, only for permitted purposes. So if they don't, it's not just intentional transfers. I mean, you can't, a government, has to have a robust enough security apparatus to keep the weapons where they're supposed to be, right? This is one thing the U.S. government is supposed to consider before we transfer the weapons as well, whether the government can maintain security of the weapons if it wants to. So yeah, I mean, there's a process to make sure the government is willing and able to make sure that the weapons stay where they're supposed to, and there is end-use monitoring, which involves, at least in some cases, people, like I say, going to check to make sure the weapons are where they're supposed to be. I mean, you could say, the government has to say, they're stored, say, in this warehouse, and like U.S. somebody from the embassy, typically the countries, would go there and check the warehouse to see if they're there. Nevertheless, it happens, right? And that's the question. I mean, what do we do after that? And it's a tough one. I think, reducing, either ending or decreasing the arms sales to that country, the question is one action we can take for sure. Particularly the kinds of, say, look, if you can't maintain security, I can do more. You could also do things like say, well, okay, you can have, the guns are there, but you're not getting the ammunition, which at least means, that's less risk of the guns being used because there's no ammunition for them. But it's a tough question. I mean, that is, so to answer your question, those are the mechanisms that are prevented, how well they work. It's hard to say. And one thing you also reminded me that there are reports that there are weapons that ended up in the hands of ISIS. I think it's called the weapons of ISIS report. And there were some items that looked like they might have come been supplied by the U.S. government that ended up there. And as far as we can tell, what happened was some weapons were purchased by the United States from Europe, and then probably supplied to some resistance fighters who support the region. Somehow ISIS got hold of those weapons, maybe they defeated them or stole them or whatever, and yes, so these weapons that were not supposed to be there, nevertheless were there. And Yeah, so that's to answer your question. I mean, one argument, I mean, I can see, potential counterplay to be improved at use monitoring. And that this has come under increasing scrutiny in recent years to make sure it's good question.
You said a country can be cut off from arms sales. Has this ever happened yet, or like?
I started thinking about this like 2 minutes before I started talking. So, yeah, yes. I'm trying to remember if there's a case when we completely cut off a country. I can't remember one. That doesn't mean there isn't one. I can tell you there are cases where, yeah, we've definitely stopped the sale of certain items because the way, we don't, the way, these kinds of sales work is, I mean, they're specifically approved by Congress. It's not an either or. I mean, it's not like we sell weapons or we don't, except for state-sponsored terrorism, but leaving them aside. They're individual sales that are made pursuant to letters of author acceptance, as I mentioned. So yeah, I mean, there are sales we've refused to make for sure. And in some cases, yeah, I mean, in some other cases we've delayed them. So Bahrain is one because we've had concerns about the human rights record. The Philippines is another one. So yeah, Pakistan, what Congress has done, we cut off sales in the 80s because they developed nuclear weapons and they violated the law. What Congress has done with Pakistan is to say that we won't finance the sale of certain aircraft. So it's a good, I mean, right, there are consequences that are largely theoretical in nature. So I don't know better what's off the top of my head.
What role would the executive branch play if Congress used something like the War Powers Act to take more control over arms sales?
That's a good question, although I don't know that the War Powers Act, and this is one of those things, I have somebody who knows everything about the War Powers Act, just stuff off of me, so I have a ton of questions to him. I don't know that it governs arms sales exactly. I think that they're, the War Powers Act basically governs actions by U.S. military forces, which does not include arms sales, to the best of my knowledge. So I could see it being accounted, and I'm not sure of the impact. Foreign military sales of DCS.
So basically, going off of the cutting off arms sales, is there like a certain amount of time that a country has to violate regulations for arms sales to be cut off?
No, no. In practice, I think we try to give countries a chance to improve their behavior because typically, look, we sold oftentimes, especially if it's a major sale, we sold countries weapons for a reason because we thought it was a good idea. And so, there's a reluctance to cut off some countries because we worry about, we worry that U.S. credibility will be harmed. We worry about what other countries will think, right? So it may not be just about that country, but we'll say, well, country X thing if we cut off country Y. So no, there's not. I mean, what happens in practice is countries, after a while, if it gets really egregious, then that's kind of a last. It's kind of a last resort. But no, there's not something like that.
Who makes the laws and restrictions for U.S. arms sales?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Who makes the laws and restrictions?
Congress. They're contained in the mainly the Arms Export Control Act and the Foreign Assistance Act. They're implemented by the State Department pursuant to the International Traffic in Arms Regulations. So you have the laws, the FAA and the Arms Export Control Act. You have the regulation, which is ITAR, or International Traffic in Arms Regulations, and they set out the regulations. And then, mostly State Department Defense.
We'll use technology, so it's Congress that proposes those weapons?
No. Well, dual use items are not weapons. There's civilian items that have some potential military applications. Okay, so those can be, many forms of, information technology, things that can be used to use and develop certain kinds of chemical, biological agents. There are some kinds of civilian nuclear there's a very long, detailed list. And they are governed by, there's a law that the Export Control Act of 2018 governs those sales. And they're controlled by the Commerce Department. They're entirely separate set of regulations. Congress has given, the way I think about it is Congress adopted the law which gives the Commerce Department the authority to implement the regulations, and they're called the Export Administration Regulations. It's just an entirely different universe of items. So just because, what I'm trying to get at is just because you might find somebody who says, hey, this item is used as a weapon. If it's on the Commerce Control List, it's not governed by Foreign Military Sales and Production.
Alright, so if we develop like a new kind of weapon that's more effective than current weapons, so are there any obligations to tell anyone or trade with them?
No, there's certain things, I mean, systems we have the capability to classify, we don't want them, but we're also not under any obligation to sell it. And in fact, there's one part of the review I mentioned is there's an entire office of Defense Technology Security Agency of the Defense Department. And what they do, they review proposals for military sales that we have used for export licenses to make sure that we're not selling technology that's too advanced, that would compromise our military's ability. So, we're not under any obligation to tell anyone or to sell anything or otherwise. And there can be some tension because our governments want the best things that we have. And, there are some people who say, yeah, they should have it, others say, well, we're the only ones who have that.
How dependent is the defense industrial base on arms sales?
An excellent question. The defense, it depends on who you ask. And I am not, again, fortunate we have at least one or two people who are experts on the defense industrial base. Some folks, particularly from the defense industrial base, will say that our foreign sales are very important. Others question that. There's at least one legal provision I'm aware of, although I don't know much about it, that basically allows the United States to help the defense industrial base, the U.S. government, to help individual companies if there's an urgent need for it. Like if there's some capability that we're just not able to, our military can't obtain. So it's a factual question, let's put it that way, that is good to debate. And to a certain extent, I mean, I think in many ways, it's not a question of the defense industrial base collapsing. The question oftentimes, that it would make it more, the weaker the defense industrial base is, the harder it is for the Defense Department to get items that it needs at the cost that it wants. So it may be that certain capabilities might exist, but they might end up being very expensive. There are certain, the F-35 aircraft is kind of, it's a slightly different animal, but this is sort of one of the poster children for, a system that is very, very, very expensive. And we want to sell as many as we can because we want to keep the unit cost down. The cost per airplane down for the U.S. military.
So the countries that are sold the arms sales, are they
Sorry, can you
allowed,
raise that? My hearing is terrible.
so like the countries that are giving the arms sales, are they allowed to modify the weapons?
Are they allowed to modify them?
Yeah.
With permission, yes. They have to get permission to do that. And so, they can't simply do whatever they want. They would have to get permission in advance from the U.S. government. That's my understanding. Yeah.
When you sell a weapon, are all rights given to it? So does that mean that the country can then modify it if you sell them?
No. There are restrictions. There are restrictions. I mean, as I said, I think if a country wants to modify it somehow, they would have to get permission from the U.S. government.
But you said that sometimes when you're done with certain technology, you sell it completely.
Oh, those are excess defense. That's different. That's excess defense articles. And no, there are restrictions on those too. I mean, it depends on what it is. I mean, frequently, if something ends up in the excess defense articles category, it's not particularly advanced anymore. And sometimes they're even, I mean, from what I understand, that sometimes after, like there are systems I think we have basically just left in Afghanistan because we didn't want to transfer them. It wasn't worth bringing them back to the United States because that's expensive. So, but no, we don't. No, we retain all kinds of rights on just about anything we sell or otherwise transmit, at least on paper. Sorry.
You said something about NUS monitoring?
It's called end-use monitoring. End, second word use, and then monitoring. Yeah, and that, it is what it sounds like. It's to ensure that items are being, you know, they're in they are where they're supposed to be and they're being used for what they're supposed to be used for. Yeah.
Can you repeat
the end.
question?
How many of like?
Oh, yeah, sure. So,
Do you know roughly how many of each weapon are sold?
roughly how many what?
Of each weapon are sold?
Do I know roughly how many each weapon is sold? No.
Have there been any cases in the United States trying to retract weapons sold to another country?
Sorry, cases where the United States what?
Where the United States is trying to retract weapons sold to another country?
Retract? What do you mean? Bring them back?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I don't know. I suspect so. Oftentimes the modification that what we'll do are, rather than take the item back, we'll either cut off or threaten to cut off support services, for example. So for the example of the case of Saudi Arabia, there's been one idea that's, well, and this is a lie actually. One way to kind of get at the problem, some of the issues we've had with the Saudis is to prohibit in-flight refueling of the aircraft. So we haven't said we're going to take the aircraft back, but U.S. combat military personnel participated in in-flight refueling of these aircraft. So, you know, we won't take the aircraft back, but we'll try to, you know, under certain conditions, make sure you can't fly them. So.
Has it ever happened where, like, we've sold weapons to a country and then, like, something happened and then we got into, like, not really a war, but, like, an issue with them and they used the weapons against us?
I think the closest I can think of to an example, the answer is yes, I believe so. And there are reports of not necessarily a war happening, but of sort of U.S. Say small arms being used against U.S. forces, probably because they were stolen or obtained illegitimately. One of the Iraq in 1991 oftentimes is really the example cited because we were a key supplier of military equipment to the Iraqi government during the 1980s. We weren't the only ones. And then of course we invaded Iraq in 1991 and they had some US supplied military hardware. Whether and to what extent it played a significant role in the conflict, I just don't know.
So if we ever, like, sold weapons to a country and the government ended up being corrupt and used the weapons against their civilians, like, would the U.S. have to be liability issues?
What, I'm sorry, what's the last question, the last part?
Like, would the U.S. like be liable to have, like, anything?
With the US what?
Would be liable to liability.
Oh, yeah. I don't know if in a legal sense we would be, but certainly this has been, it's certainly damaging to U.S. reputation. The question is whether the U.S. would be liable if a government used U.S. supplied weapons against its own population, right? Like I said, whether anybody could win a court case, I couldn't say. I genuinely don't know, but it's a concern because obviously, look, we generally don't want governments to do things like that, and it does make the U.S. look terrible. You know, I mean, part of this, the idea of selling weapons is that it improves our international standing and not makes it worse. And so, yeah, it's certainly something that, you know, the United States takes into account. Yeah, and even if there's a possibility a government might do it, that's certainly something we take into account. Yeah. How we find out? Again, it's through end-use monitoring, which the extent to which they have access to intelligence information, I don't know. But that's how. I mean, we monitor. We have personnel. In some cases they're in the country, some cases they're in the region, but we have people who actually visit the country. And the agreements we have in place with the government allow, basically give us the right to go onto their military bases and make sure that the item in question is where it's supposed to be. Some kinds of violations, from what I understand, are harder to monitor than others. I mean, making sure that an aircraft is on the airfield where it's supposed to be is pretty easy because you go look and you don't even need to visit it. I mean, you can probably check through other means and just see, you know, the aircraft's there or it's not. Other reports can be more difficult to verify, but that's the mechanism we have.
You talked about U.S. weapons against ISIS. So what would be the protocol after that happens? After our weapons fall into the hands of our enemies?
That's an excellent question. I don't know the answer concern. And I'll say, these are reports. I don't know for certain that is true. I wouldn't swear to it. Yeah, I mean, that's a very difficult one, especially because the enemy in that question is, I mean, ISIS is not a state, really. It's not officially government. So the question, who do you call? Once that happens, I mean, oftentimes that means, I think what that means, we work with whatever responsible parties we can find to get them back. Yeah, but that's I mean, there is an entire, what would happen in that particular instance, I'm not sure. There are programs that the U.S. government runs to try to stop the illicit trafficking of weapons, not just U.S. origin weapons, but all other types as well. There's an entire office of the State Department called the Office of Weapons Movement, and the state also gives money to various groups to try to get illicit weapons out of circulation. It's hard to do.
How do treaties and non-state actors like the UN affect arms sales?
They don't, in terms of U.S. arms sales, they don't really, we're not, the United States is a signatory to the Arms Trade Treaty, which you'll probably read about. And it's been submitted to the Senate for advice and consent to ratification. The Senate has not chosen to ratify it. This administration is also, they've said they were going to unsign the treaty. I don't know if they actually went as far as to do that. I don't think they did. I mean, it doesn't really matter. I mean, the thing is, the Arms Trade Treaty is, in effect, would not require any radical changes in U.S. policy. I don't think it would require any at all, actually. It's basically, the point of that treaty is to get other governments to follow the same procedures that we and the European Union follow. So it doesn't directly implicate it. The only other one instance I can think of are sometimes the UN will place an arms embargo on a country. So there's one on Libya, for example, and the United States, at least as a matter of policy, obeys those. That's, you know, if you look at the international traffic of arms regulations, you can find countries that are subject to arms embargoes. So there's a list of countries to which, you know, it's not permitted to sell weapons, and typically that includes, you know, countries subject to UN arms embargoes.
Have there been some cases where you would sell arms without going through the process?
Not supposed to. I mean, look, I couldn't swear to you it never happens, but no, I mean, the process is supposed to, you know, as I said, I mean, there's the DCS and the FMS process, and then the other ones I mentioned, covert action, excess defense articles. But no, I mean, they're all supposed to go through that process. If they don't, it's illegal, as far as I know. Yeah.
There's some countries that we don't sell arms to.
So I need to speak up a little bit.
You mentioned there's some countries that we don't sell weapons to at all, but who determines who you can and can't sell arms to?
So countries we don't sell weapons to at all.
Yeah, do you know who determines who you can and can't sell arms to?
Do I know who they are? I know some of them. I don't have the list committed to memory, but I mean, it's, try to think, Syria, Iran, IS, North Korea, Sudan, I think. All the countries on the state-sponsored terrorism list. Cyprus, Libya, and there's some others to which, you know, generally they're either state sponsors of terrorism or subject to UN arms embargoes. Cyprus, I think, is a bit of a different animal, but so there's a list, and it's in the, like I said, it's in the international traffic and arms regulations.
How would the U.S. handle the case when the weapons are being used, like against civilians?
Sorry, what's it?
How would the U.S. handle the case if your weapons
How
are
do we
being used
handle it?
against
Oh,
civilians?
well, I mean, the first thing we do, I think, is raise it diplomatically, is wherever the government is, and obviously try to get the facts straight and all the rest. And then it depends. It's on a case-by-case basis. It depends on what our relationship is with that government. I mean, look, we could cut the country off from arms sales in the future. I mean, there's a number of actions we can take against countries who violate human rights, including sanctions, and some other measures like that. So there are a number of tools available. What we would do depends on the circumstances. You know, there are people who will say, you know, certain governments that say they're abusing human rights, you know, they're using U.S. weapons to, you know, commit human rights abuses, and we should cut off those sales, maybe implement other sanctions. Others will say that, you know, that the relationship with the country is too important and we shouldn't do that. There are also, I mean, there's all the sort of middle ground, if you want one, is that we could either cut certain sales off or we could modify them. So, you know, for example, there's, you know, we could say, look, you can only, you know, we're going to, you know, increase our monitoring of whatever it is we sell to you. We're going to make sure you only sell it to, only this part of your military can buy them. So like your secret police can't have them, but this part of your army could. So the other.
Based on what you've seen, like in your line of work, what do you think would actually happen in the case that we stop selling arms to a specific country or stop selling a specific type of weapon?
It depends on the country, depends on the weapons. I think, it's part of the reason actually I think this is a good topic is because frequently bilateral relationship with other countries are perceived, are kind of characterized as being an all or nothing proposition. So lots of times dissents, right, or like, you hurt our bilateral relations with a country, nuclear war, right? Now, the truth is there are things we could do that might annoy other governments, but I don't necessarily think they would destroy our relationship with that government. Also, in the long run, it might improve them. I'm not sure that it helps us if governments kind of think they can pretty much do anything they want without us saying anything about it. But again, it's, and so in some cases, maybe not much. Other cases, it could be extremely consequential. I wish I had a better answer, but I don't. So, sorry, at the back there.
Do we need bipartisanship to approve, modify, or deny an export license?
I'm sorry, one more time.
Do we need bipartisanship, like in the government, to approve, modify, or deny an export license?
No, because Congress doesn't have. Only some export licenses are subject to congressional approval. Okay, they have to meet. They have to meet a certain dollar threshold. They have to cost a certain amount. The item has to cost a certain amount, and it depends on the governments that we're selling them to. So in that case, Congress would have the opportunity to adopt a joint resolution of disapproval, and which would prohibit the sale. Now, I mean, there's nothing that requires there to be a bipartisan majority, but you can imagine that with the current composition of Congress, especially the Senate, as a practical matter, yeah, you would. You need at least some buy-in some from both sides of the aisle to approve it. Yeah. And that's happened. Not with an export license, but with foreign military sales. Oh no, and direct commercial sales too. I apologize.
So when a country, like when we sell a country something from us, and we have to take it away and make modifications, is there a way that we can be like, you can't get this back if you do something else with it?
I mean, typically we wouldn't physically bring it back to the United States, but yeah, we can place conditions certainly and say, that if you modify something a certain way, then get to use it, and we could take it back. Okay? So yeah, I mean, we assert a great deal of authority. That's why some governments I find this intrusive for reasons you can imagine, because they don't really like us telling them what to do, but we reserve the right to do that. Yeah.
So from the end-use monitoring, when the U.S. personnel does the inspections on other countries,
yeah,
is there do they get warned beforehand?
I believe they do. I've never actually participated in one, but people who have told me that we have some kind of an arrangement. Typically, I mean, it's case by case basis, of course, but it depends on the conditions in the country. But yeah, I mean, there are very few, if any, militaries will just allow U.S. citizens to show up, U.S. government officials rather, just to show up unannounced. And for a number of reasons, it's not a good idea from a safety standpoint and all the rest.
With the U.S. being like the largest arms sellers, is that give us any type of leverage when it comes to foreign countries?
Yes, it is. Yeah, I think so. Again, it's a debatable point, and I think there's increasingly deep literature about this because people, have looked into this question. How much? Certainly the United States said, the U.S. government says it would. It's intuitive that it would. I mean, it kind of makes sense. And there's a good, one argument people make, and this is, people make this in the real world, it's not just a debate argument, that if we stop selling weapons or sell fewer weapons to a certain part of the world, then other countries will fill in. Like they say, they'll go to the Chinese, they'll go to the Russians, maybe some others, and buy the same weapon systems from them. So, but we'll say, well, look, we have, when we establish things like foreign military, do foreign military sales, we establish a long-term relationship with that military. We provide a lot of assistance to them. And when you're talking about over the lifetime of a weapon system, that's probably about 20 years. We also, will generally say that our support and technology are better. So that's why people should buy from us. In terms of influence, yeah, I mean, if we have the argument is if we have a close relationship with the military and other parts of the government, then we can influence their policy. The question oftentimes is, okay, well, now you have that influence, now what? And that's where, there's certain governments, will say that we can influence, country X, and then some will push and say, okay, we should go do that. And the kind of paradox is that you can have a very deep relationship, which will give you a lot of influence, but also means you'll be reluctant to jeopardize it, right? So it's a difficult balance that no one's figured out how to sort out yet, in my opinion.
The U.S. government ever devalue their weapons for the sake of bypassing congressional implementation?
What do you mean? Sell it for less money. Who knows? I mean, I don't think so. And the thing is, I doubt it because I think we have. I suppose in theory we could sell weapons really cheap to another country in order to keep them below that threshold. I guess that could happen. We have a lot of incentive to sell weapons for whatever we might. Especially if it's direct commercial, so companies want as much money as they can get from them. So we don't have much incentive to do that, but I guess they could. I hope that. Yeah.
What about like countries we do in America, say, I don't know, especially who how you're going to bring it to the U.S. and not maintain the military? Are they capable of, are the governments capable of purchasing defense articles under different regulations? Who would then be in charge of securing them in those countries? You mentioned something about the distinction between not allowing special police or only certain defense parts of the military have access. And so how does that work in countries where we don't allow military?
That's an excellent question. I don't know. I mean, the thing is, one of the requirements is they have to have, they have to have a good reason to buy the weapons, and they have to have the infrastructure
to. Always include weapons. That was the beginning of the conversation.
No, that's right. It doesn't. Right. So defense. Yeah. I mean, I think if it's a defense article that that we think has a legitimate purpose and that can be provided the required amount of protection, yeah, I don't see why we couldn't do that. How that interacts with the specific agreements we have with those countries, I don't know. But no, there are certain things I could see. We could say, yeah, we'll sell you protective gear for something or other. If there is some legitimate purpose, for that, they can keep it where it's supposed to be. I don't see why they couldn't do that. Yeah.
So if we sell like somebody works to a country, is there a way that they can sell that weapon to another country without asking them?
No, not legally. They have to agree not to transfer the weapons. That's a requirement. So there's another.
Just to be clear, the direct commercial sales and the foreign military sales don't include civilian sales?
Sorry, whether FMS and DCS include civilian sales? No, not really. I mean, they include the items that are on the U.S. munitions list, okay, which are defense articles and not civilian by definition. There are items that like I said, dual-use items, which are primarily civilian, but could have military applications. FMS and DCS do not include those. Those are all items on what's called the Commerce Control List, and they're all administered through the Commerce Department. So, no, I mean, it can be a bit of a debate over whether something constitutes a weapon, but really what's dispositive, I mean, what's key is what's on the U.S. munitions list.
When you take arms back to that country that you sell it to, do they get their money back?
I don't know. It depends on the circumstances. I don't think we do that very often, so I'm not really sure. I think it would depend on the circumstances. I mean, there's certain, I think in general we would probably try to do that. Try to give them their money back. I mean, there are certain actions that the U.S. can take in extreme situations, but we frequently try not to, because they're disruptive. I mean, there are cases in which, say, for example, we could cancel a contract for a weapon with another government if we really thought we had a good reason. We try not to do that because, you know, the sanctity of contracts is very important for the U.S. government. It's the credibility of our commitments is important for us and for other governments. So those are things that we try not to do. So I suspect, in many cases, I think we try to try to minimize disruption, if that makes any sense.
Does FMS commercial sales regulate the sale of weapons to other countries' police forces?
Yes, and I'm trying to think. I think for FMS, we might not be, in some cases, we're not allowed to sell items to police forces through the FMS process. There's a Defense Security Cooperation Agency has a list that I looked at actually earlier today about what can and can't be sold via FMS, and at least some items I think cannot be sold to police forces via that process. And there are other programs we have in terms of building partnership capacity and things like counter narcotics assistance and that international law enforcement, and those tend to be other avenues for selling them. I don't know the details.
Are there any regulations blocking like other countries from recreating?
Sorry, a little bit louder.
Are there any regulations blocking other countries from making U.S.-made weapons?
From using U.S.-made weapons?
From recreating.
Oh, recreate, yes. Yeah, they're not. Other countries are not supposed to, without permission, are not supposed to reproduce or U.S. weapons. I mean, that's one. The phenomenon oftentimes is called the technical data, the kinds of information a government or company would need to use in order to make a weapon, blueprints and all that kind of thing. Those are all controlled for export. Okay. Now, there is a phenomenon called reverse engineering, which basically means you take an item and then figure out how to build it yourself. There generally are restrictions. There are restrictions against that kind of thing. So doing that without permission is not allowed.
So if it's like.
All right, we have time for one more question. So one more question. So,
recognizing that 2020 is going to be a presidential election year and half of the country is elected to Congress, I wonder if there are any states or any particular legislators that you feel like are doing very well in terms of understanding this international issue. Or there are places where, I know, Washington State, they really, they're working with universities or whatever, and their congressional representation is doing very well in terms of, doing policy and understanding what, what these treaties, well, not treaties, but, what these laws have.
I don't want to get into any specific legislators because I'll leave someone out or get it wrong, and we're not really supposed to talk about the work we do with them directly. But there are, I mean, the places where, honestly, a lot of congressional interest comes from the districts where there are manufacturers of weapons. I mean,
so everybody in Virginia, Texas, Alabama,
California. California's a tremendous number of defense contractors. Washington State as well. I mean, yeah, you can figure out, where they are and how much influence they have, and oftentimes questions we will get will be from, and this isn't really for FMS and DC, so we do get some of those, but it will be like that. Somebody asked for an export license. A company applied for an export license. They haven't heard anything back for 6 months. They would like to know why. And we tell them we're not a licensing agent. I don't know why. They won't tell me, but nor will they tell me. But so a lot of times, I mean, the questions we get are very mundane like that, and so that's where a lot of the interest is really on the individual company side, on the economic side of it really. Now in terms of the bigger issues, it's really Yemen, and Saudi Arabia and Yemen really seems to have, for reasons I partly understand, reasons I partly do not, just attract a tremendous amount of attention. What parts of the country are more interested in that than others, I couldn't say. I simply don't know. But I mean, the politics debate, and for politics purposes, it's going to be awesome. I mean, it really is going to be.
All right. So can we give our speaker a round of applause? I have the list of the people in my lab. Does everybody else have theirs, or do they want to pull it up? All right. So for me, if you're going with me, this is a JV lab. There's no number here, but Sheridan Easterling, Ifalawa Atkins, Sonia, Tim Oshiaka, Will Rogers, Edward Rogers, Kayla Park, Asiata Mange, Protas, Ioma? Yeah, there you go. Adamide, Agulu Moffin, Aaron Smith, Chauncey Roscoe, Demola. I can speak, I forget I know it's an impression and joke, but actually that is one of Ahmad Curtis, is it Lokin or Eokin? Brooke McClinton.
I wrote some notes on that paper.
You're terrible, sir. No. Karanu Baylor, D'Angelo Pierce. So if I just said your name, please walk with me. We're supposed to.
Where? I'm not touching.
Okay. Can I get your attention, please? Hello, I'm Darian Carroll. I am leading the JV Transition to Varsity Lab. If you hear your name, it's practice for graduation. Please get up, come this way so we can go to the lab room. Tyler Davis. Eno Singh. Emilio Akinsanya. Brooke Robinson. Simone Joyner. Lena Webb. Jaden Miles Richardson. Joey Villaflor. Jenner Dalton. Max Washington. David Slebo. Dylan Denny. Samantha Perkins. Godwill Tawan. Eleanor Catherine. Javad Singh.
No, they didn't call me.
Cordell Eating. Yuma Uba. Okay.
I think you should go to the JV, the varsity one. Just slide on in. You need to ask them that one. I run this. Bye. Bye.
Alright, I'm Jackie. If I call your name, you should follow Aubrey, Sandra Romualdo, Ernest Natamu, Nala Burkhalter, Pearl Mongo, Carmel D'Souza, Michelle Njoku, Lanyan Tankin, Elizabeth Bala, Kevin Daisy, Max Onaki, I'm probably butchering some of these, I apologize. Tim Neal, Paula Almendarez, Lola Rogan, Isatu Dawara, Asha Verma, Aisha Bob, Justin Sioto, and Caitlin McClinton.
Bye, guys.
Okay, I'm David Leo. You're taking varsity lab with me. Got Lucy Chamberlain, Zara Escobar, Kaylee Law, Alexandra Clark, Alexa Figuera, Dennis Martinez, Chloe Mashana, Clark